without that digital mindfulness, without that really expansive notion of digital literacy, we're sort of prey to our own worst instincts in a way. And I think there's the real need for this kind of intentionality, for this taking responsibility, for this stepping back and reflecting.
Welcome to Digital Mindfulness. I'm your host, Lawrence Ampofo. Today we're here with Elizabeth Marsh, and she's the Director of Research at the Digital Workplace Group. In today's show, we're going to talk a lot about the impact of technology in the workplace, and in particular, why digital literacy is so important. You should listen to this episode if you want to understand just how technology affects your workplace performance, why digital literacy will enable you to become a better professional, and also how you can use digital mindfulness to build a better relationship with your digital devices. But first off, welcome to Digital Mindfulness, where we aim to bring together the best teachers and thought leaders to teach you how to be your best self in an age of digital distraction and information overload, both at work and in your personal lives. If you're new to the show, then the best place to find out much more about what we do is to visit digitalmindfulness.net/start, which has a collection of some required listening podcasts where we discuss everything from becoming more focused in a distracted world to habit building, overcoming digital distraction, cyberbullying, internet addiction, and much, much more. Okay, so on with the show with Elizabeth Marsh. So, Elizabeth, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm really excited to talk to you more about innovation in the workplace and how technology is impacting on that. So, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks, Lawrence. Great to be here.
So, Elizabeth, just for the members of the audience that don't know much about your work, I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about how you came to focus on this area of technology in the workplace and innovation.
Yeah, so I've been working in the field of workplace technology for around 15 years, and specifically in the area of intranets and the wider digital workplace. So I'm not a technologist, but I've very much worked in roles that act as a bridge between IT and the business. So looking at, how do we understand business and user needs? How do we define strategy, put in place governance, support adoption? And for the last 8 years, I've been working with an organization called Digital Workplace Group, which is a global digital workplace community, and it's also a boutique consulting organization. And at DWG, I run the best practice research program. And I always say research is definitely my first love. So at DWG, we get to do a range of research papers looking at topics that are interesting to large organizations. So things like user experience, defining digital workplace strategy, understanding the influence of culture, looking at things like organizational readiness for digital working. Could be search, findability, measurement. So there's a real range of topics. I think there's a library of about 60 papers there now. And then kind of based out of that, I also co-authored a book called The Digital Renaissance of Work, Delivering Digital Workplaces Fit for the Future, with DWG's CEO and founder, Paul Miller. And then I'm sort of a freelance researcher and writer as well. So I've worked on a couple of different projects this year, looking at things like digital engagement, talking to technology entrepreneurs, which was a bit different. And somehow in all of that, I'm also fitting in.
So Elizabeth, I'm wondering if you can tell us then, from the research that you've done and from everything that's coming up more widely in the industry, what would you say are the human and business impacts of constant connectivity?
Yeah, I think this is something that we're all grappling with, both as individuals and organisations. And we hear a lot about, things like digital burnout and organisations trying different strategies to sort of help their employees to find an appropriate balance or blend as it gets called sometimes now. So I think that, I wrote recently about digital burnout, and there had been an example of, I think in France, they were bringing in a law to help people actually have a right to disconnect and sort of turn off email, at a certain time centrally in the organisation. And, when I see things like this, I think in a way it sort of misses the point. I think there's an opportunity there for us to learn how to use technology in a kind of supportive, life supportive way, rather than being just kind of overtaken by it. But switching off the technology doesn't give us an opportunity to learn that. So, some of these examples come from companies like, for example, Volkswagen, this idea of switching off the technology. But then I've seen other examples where I think a more thoughtful approach, and one example I think is from Deutsche Telekom, who put in place a policy which was about helping people to achieve sustainable work styles, including the role that technology can play in that, and actually defining, for example, perhaps times when people wanted to be free of technology or when they could be contacted. And that to me is us starting to work towards a better relationship with technology where it works for us rather than kind of taking us over. So, I mean, that's at an organizational level. I think as individuals, we're also trying to grapple with, finding different strategies to make, I suppose, have technology in the right place in our lives, but also as remote workers as well, to enable a sense of connection to other people. And I think that's a whole skill set that, I think a lot of people are learning sort of almost by accident or as a byproduct of working in that way and trying to find, what's the right balance of connection. When do I actually need to meet people? When will a Skype call suffice or an email? And finding how to keep that kind of human quality in place while we are at a distance.
I want to go back. I want to go back to what you were talking about in terms of policymakers trying to get involved in this idea of almost like tech and work-life balance. And I think it's really fascinating that as we're becoming more connected, and the office and the actual work, so our homes and the office become collapsed. That policymakers are trying to, I don't know, it feels like assert more control over the way people behave with work. And I'm wondering why you think it's the case, why policymakers, both at a corporate level and at a governmental level, use these approaches, like almost like a mother talking to a child, right? That, no, that's it. At 6 o'clock, you turn the video games off and go to eat your dinner or something. Why do you think policymakers get involved in that way?
I suppose there's a fear of the backlash that we're seeing in some ways, and the consequences for the company, and sort of cases being brought against them, for instance. And I think there's generally a sort of fear about that we are slightly overwhelmed individually and together by technology. And I suppose in a way the first reaction is, well, we need to switch it off. We need to move away from it. And I think that's interesting also in terms of, to some extent, different generations and demographics. So although I'm always a little bit skeptical about some of the headlines around different generations with technology, but I think there's some interesting aspects there. So I'm apparently Generation X, and so I didn't grow up with technology. And I feel in some ways that I have a certain advantage in that I feel like I can take it and leave it. But for me then, as, say, a leader or someone, making a policy or whatever it is, to say, to take a certain approach that doesn't really embrace living with technology, I think isn't right, because then, as we know, sort of millennials or people coming up who've grown up with technology, have had that kind of constant sort of presence of technology. So I think that we need to embrace rather than move away from. And embracing, we start to look at things like, what's the culture of the organization? So even before we get to the technology, does the culture encourage people to live and work in a sustainable way, or does it encourage burnout, digital or otherwise? And of course, that starts with leaders in particular and the behaviours that they're modelling. And I mean, there was a great example that came up at a Digital Workplace Group where Paul Miller kind of suddenly said on our Yammer network, his working pattern has changed from working perhaps in a more traditional time pattern to actually logging on sort of a bit more often. And he might be doing some work on a Sunday or late at night, but his work has become much more blended into his life. But then he was thinking about what's the impact of that on, the 60 or so people that work with DWG, if they're seeing messages from me. And he actually wrote a message and said, just because you see a message from me on a Sunday or late at night doesn't mean that I expect that from you. Obviously I expect a timely reply in the next, whatever it is, day or so. And it was great that he reflected on that. And I think he later wrote a post on LinkedIn about that as well. And so it's, as leaders thinking about not only their relationship to technology and work, but also the impact on people as well. And I think that's very important. And I also tend to think, particularly for those of us working in the digital space, or it could be communications, learning these different aspects of the organization who are sort of working with technology in different ways, is that in a way everyone is a digital pioneer now. So we all have to think about what are our practices with technology and how does that kind of ripple out to the people around us or the people in our teams, etc.
I really liked what you just said, and I just wanted to kind of go back and tease out something small that you kind of said it very quickly, but it was this whole idea that because with digital devices, they enable people who have, say, different working patterns, right? People who may say prefer to work at home or prefer to work from different hours when their energy levels are up. That allows them to do that. But from the perspective of the culture of the company, like, you're right, if your colleagues expect, if when they receive a message, they think, oh my God, I've got to respond, right, in a timely way, which is in a couple of minutes. So what I guess my question is, when in the digital workplace or in a digitized workplace, do you think the culture then has to lean towards being more flexible and almost like having less expectations on timeliness to help the well-being of employees or your colleagues?
I think that the reality in a lot of organisations is that attitudes are still fairly traditional with respect to work patterns. And we're seeing a shift, but I think it's perhaps it's easy to forget working perhaps in I work in a sort of freelance style and with a very a team that are thinking about this all the time, and it can be easy to forget that I think in a lot of organisations that is still a lot more traditional, and even our own attitude. So I've had conversations with colleagues about the meaning of sort of presence on Skype, for instance, and what does and the need also as a remote worker to kind of show presence and kind of manage presence. So our own attitudes can be sort of need to be constantly reworked in that respect. But I think there are organisations that are trying to, gradually shift from this really industrial revolution concept of, that we need to be sitting in the office at a specified time and seem to be working. And that isn't actually human. It isn't actually, in the end, more productive. And of course, then we get onto the question of trust and building trust in the digital workplace. And that comes around, performance and outputs, and a lot about how we communicate, digitally. And I tend to say we sort of assume that we should just know how to do it digitally, that we should just know, that it should just be a digital representation of what we do, non-digitally. And I actually think there's a learning curve that we need to allow ourselves to go on, and it's probably constant actually as different tools arise. It's almost about trying to, how do we humanize that digital world, and how do we bring those human qualities in to the digital world that we're living in increasingly.
One of the things that you wrote about, and this makes it seem like I only read one of your articles. It's just not true. But in the digital burnout article that you wrote, you mentioned that having a mindful relationship to technology is one of the solutions to this. And I'm wondering if you can just explain a little bit more. Of course, I know I think a mindful relationship to technology is, but what would you say that would look like?
I mean, I suppose I'm thinking about it at quite an individual level, and in that post, sort of reflecting on my own experience and some of the things I've read, and to some extent, it's about experimenting with our own technology practices. So, which I can see have changed for me over the years, and my relationship, say, to my mobile phone or whatever. I started at one point using moment to look at, how much time was I spending on my phone, and how often was I picking it up, and that was quite interesting. But it made me reflect, perhaps not so much about the amount of time, because, for example, I use my phone a lot as a radio, for instance. So that it fulfills a lot of purposes. But I was like, well, what's the quality of that interaction? So when I pick up that phone however many times a day, where am I when I do that? And I did a little experiment on myself, which I called the mindful unlock, which was just trying to, every time I picked my phone up, was just quickly making a note of what was going on at that moment. And had I picked it up for a specific purpose? Was I aware I was going to pick it up and use it? Or was it just adding to my own distraction in my mind? Was it because of a moment of insecurity? Was it because of, as I say, simply being distracted or being bored? I'm not sure I really get bored, but or whatever it was, feeling lonely, and looking at that. And I suppose I didn't really come to any particular conclusion, but it made me very aware of how easy it is for that just to be an extension of my own mental state, rather than more purposeful. And I mentioned in that article that I wrote about Damon Young, who's a sort of digital philosopher and wrote a book called Distraction. He said that we need to develop a more ambitious relationship to our tools. And I really liked that, because it was such a positive way of thinking about the fact that we need to not just be sort of mired in a sort of mindless relationship with technology that just sort of hooks or addicts or seduces us, but actually seek out, both as individuals and as people designing or developing technology, what does an ambitious relationship with technology look like? One that uplifts, that enables, that betters. And that's, if I then think about that relating to workplace technology, that's perhaps quite a long way from how we're thinking about that technology at the moment.
One of the things I wanted to talk to you about was this whole idea of digital literacy, because when I ask people how they set up systems or how they ensure that their digital life at work is productive and creative and healthy and that they can be their best selves, they say that it's actually it's a very conscious process. It's like a challenge right? They have to set up very strict systems with themselves. And I'm wondering how important you feel that things like digital literacy are in the workplace, particularly given that thought experiment you were just talking about, the mindful unlock, which I think is a really great experiment.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose to set a bit of context, I've sort of gravitated towards being more and more interested in digital literacy, and in sort of the organisations I work with and kind of projects I get involved in, we're often looking at and working with teams who are grappling with what is so often seen that the technology has been put in place in a big organisation, and great gains are expected, whether those are productivity, cost savings, and they aren't realised, and what's the reason for that? And there's a range of factors that come into that. Is there a clear strategy? Why are we using it? The user experience, governance, cultural fit, etc. But increasingly, I've been noticing, that the organisations are kind of struggling with the digital literacy element, and how do we sort of prepare people in our organisation to have not just the right skills, but the right attitudes and behaviours to get the most from this technology. And so that's got me kind of interested in this area, and I've been looking into this for my psychology master's research project, and sort of reading up on the kind of research that's been done in this area. It comes from a background of, you get various different terms. So, for instance, computer ICT literacy, which is a little bit dated now, and this is about the basic kind of ability to use computers and related technology. So we're talking about the technical skills. You get information literacy. So, can we locate and evaluate the information and use it for a specific purpose? And this is used a lot in sort of library, kind of contexts. And then you get new media literacy. So looking at a range of different formats. And again, can you kind of access and use those? And then you get this expanded concept that's talked about quite a lot, new literacies. So, and this is really about really expanding the traditional notion of literacy to different forms that are made possible by digital technologies, whether that's social networking or blogging or, working with images, etc. And then in all of this mix, you get digital literacy, which is much more looking at, that there's sort of progressive levels of skill and knowledge, and being able to not just use those, but adapt to new forms of technology, find new ways of communicating using them. And I think that adaptability is almost a sort of marker of one's level of digital literacy. And then there's lots of different, as often is the case, there's a lot of different definitions of digital literacy. And some people talk about digital literacies in the plural. So rather than trying to pin it down to one thing that we can, if we want to operationalize and train people, there's that temptation. But in the article I wrote recently, I came across this lovely phrase from Paul Gilster, who wrote a book about digital literacy back in 1997, which seems like a whole nother world now. I've just started reading his book, and he talks about mastering ideas, not keystrokes. So it's something much broader than those technical skills. And there's a definition I quite like that captures some of those different elements, and it's from the European Information Society, and they say digital literacy is the awareness, attitude, and ability of individuals to appropriately use digital tools and facilities to identify, access, manage, integrate, evaluate, analyze, and synthesize digital resources, construct new knowledge, create media expressions, and communicate with others in the context of specific life situations in order to enable constructive social action and to reflect upon this process. So, sorry, that was quite long, but I think what's quite good is that it's a definition I'm sort of quite liking at the moment, because it captures a lot of different elements, that they're not just skills that we need to learn, that there's a creative element, that these skills are very much situated in specific situations and social practices and goals that we're trying to achieve, but also that reflective component that I think is, in a way, a more advanced digital skill. That brings us to the sort of digital mindfulness. So I was looking at all of this and reading various papers, and in the post that I put up recently on LinkedIn, I was looking at really 6 different aspects to digital literacy that I was seeing across those. And they're not exactly levels, because I think, you could move through these in slightly different ways. And also, if we think about different roles in the workplace, people are going to need slightly different aspects. So I go through from the technical, so those basic kind of operational skills, then thinking about the cognitive. So can we kind of find and manage information? Can we navigate resources in a non-linear way? Are we aware of the tools that are available to us? And also that kind of thinking in real time, processing the different inputs, making sure that we don't kind of get overloaded. Then a sort of critical element, which I think is talked about quite a lot, and that's both being able to evaluate information, understanding kind of motivation behind it, and that's talked a lot about in educational contexts, but also understanding what's appropriate, what's ethical, in an organisation managing risk, or for ourselves making sure that we're safe online. So that component, and then we get to the creative element. So can we communicate? Can we create things in different formats? Can we kind of construct new knowledge and that sort of remixing element as well? And also kind of creatively applying the tools to our day-to-day work. So that's getting more into what you're talking about when, we're looking at kind of setting up our technology to actually support how we want to live and solve problems. So, I mean, the other 2 elements I was thinking about, which in some ways it gets more exciting, but I think are very, very important in the workplace as well, are the social and the innovative. So the whole element of how do we build relationships online and work in remote teams, have conversations like this. And, I've worked with people for quite long periods digitally before I've met them. And had the experience of building some tremendously strong working relationships, and then meeting each other in person is like the cherry on the cake. So, that whole area, also managing identity online, kind of avoiding, feeling cut off as a remote worker, being able to kind of promote yourself and kind of make that presence. Also, the kind of emotional intelligence aspect around kind of taking responsibility for our behaviour, awareness of the norms of how people communicate, and also talk about traditional and changing work practices. Really kind of flattening the hierarchy a bit through some of these tools, and that's definitely happening in some organisations. Well, yeah, the other aspect then getting to a sort of more innovative level, and that's where this is about almost a digitally literate attitude. It's a digital mindset where we can adapt quickly to different technologies. We can sort of self-manage effectively, identify new technologies that can really change the business and potentially even the business model. Also then bringing others with us. How do we help them to kind of really gain that digital literacy, and also sort of navigating across the physical and digital world and workplace. That's a certain type of digital mindfulness, which is knowing when not to use digital. And that's something I've definitely learned in my work when in among all the emails and WebExes and Skype calls, when is the moment, if it's possible, where we actually really do need to meet physically? And I think it's really important to know that.
No, that's. I think this is all great. This is all fantastic stuff, and I think for me, this is one of the clearest presentations, right, that I've had on what it means to be digitally mindful, because it really is a skill set, and it goes right the way from from the engineering level, from the technical approach, right the way to how we as humans approach things when we go into a digitized environment, or when we pick up those devices, like you're saying, almost with this mindful unlock. Like, it's almost like, right, why am I picking this up? Why am I going to this particular application? What effect is this going to have on me? And I really like that. There are only 6 points, but I think it, like you were saying, and that long definition of digital literacy by the European Information Society, it's long and it's cumbersome. It's cumbersome, but it's accurate. I think it really is accurate, and it encompasses so many things that I don't think that in the workplace we do consider. We just we go to our desk, we switch on our email, on another screen we'll have what we're actually doing, and I don't think we think very much about what kind of productivity cost there might be of having 2 screens, or one email that's constantly buzzing, and then our phones are going and the telephones are going, and we're also being interrupted. And so I really like what you've put here. But my question for you, the one that I was itching to ask you, is this whole idea of post-truth, being in a post-truth era, and it does relate to this whole idea of digital literacy and being digitally mindful. I spoke yesterday to a fascinating person. He's based in Washington, and he works in foreign policy. And we were talking about being in we were talking about post-truth politics, basically. That's what I was interviewing him about. And he was saying that with the Trump election, that people in Washington, it's very much a blue state for sure. But he said people were openly crying. But he was saying that for him, the bigger problem is that people don't live in the same factual universes anymore. We don't live in the same informational universes, and this is the whole thing about being in a post-truth society, right? That it doesn't, like, truth doesn't matter. Objective truth actually exists, and that's what these fact checkers were there for. Objective truth exists. It's just that it didn't matter to people, and we were saying that that's terrifying for democracy, right? And for something that requires deliberative action, basically choosing who's going to run the country, who's going to be the commander-in-chief. But if we're making decisions based on emotion, just on how we feel, it's really, really scary. And so I guess my question to you is, we're using the term post-truth now, and particularly in the workplace, in the digital workplace, there might be instances where people don't reside in the same informational universe. And I'm wondering how these points you've put down about digital literacy, how they stack up in an era when truth doesn't matter anymore, when fake news and fake information has the same weight as truthful information.
Yeah, if we look in context of large organizations, it's almost the other way around, where digital tools are helping to support cultures of greater transparency. So where there was perhaps very limited, very regulated communication in the company to employees, very formal, for instance, you're starting to see more organizations being pushed towards in the digital workplace, that leaders need to be more transparent. They need to be more present. There needs to be more of a conversation. So in that particular context, I think that's evolving quite positively. In the broader context, I think that the whole digital amplifies both the positive and the negative in us as humans, and I think it holds a mirror up to our faces that's very stark. So, and there's sort of almost an acceleration of, our I quite know how to put this, but those tendencies that we have towards perhaps, believing things that aren't necessarily true, or just quickly taking emotive decisions about things, or taking on board views, or not really reflecting, not really stepping back and gaining a more objective view. That all sort of happens in the blink of an eye in our digital universe, which is why that it brings back to, without that digital mindfulness, without that really expansive notion of digital literacy, we're sort of prey to our own worst instincts in a way. That we, and I think there's the real need for this kind of intentionality, for this taking responsibility, for this stepping back and reflecting on how those, how we're evolving a digital universe that reflects. It's going to reflect us as humans in all ways, but how do we really amplify the more positive elements, and also use it as a mirror to I suppose to grow and reflect in ourselves. So that's a slightly woolly answer, I'm aware, but that's sort of where I'm at with it at the moment.
Well, see, this is the thing with tech and life balance, in that once the research comes out, we think we understand what's going on, the interaction between humans and the way that they work and live with their technologies, and then the global political landscape just changes completely overnight and throws everything into disarray. And I think, to me, what's most interesting is this idea of time that you mentioned earlier, that we need time to understand how we're interacting. We need time to make the research, to analyze. And I'm wondering if you think that this is really the essence here of what we need to be striving for, that we need to be patient with ourselves, and we need to allow ourselves the time to really understand not only how we build this technology, but also how it is interacting with us over time.
Oh, in a sense, although there is an urgency, because what we're creating now has very large implications, as we're already seeing, for where we're going collectively. So comfortable. I mean, I think the adaptability and the intentionality are really important. In some way, it's probably good that we should be uncomfortable rather than comfortable, because I know what you mean, but I'm sort of just changing that slightly. That we should be a bit uncomfortable about this and a bit disturbed, and there is an urgency that we need to kind of have that intention around what we create. And in going back to that article that you mentioned earlier about digital burnout, and I quote a story of Thich Nhat Hanh giving a talk at Google a few years back, and I really love this. And he tells this story. There's a man sitting on a horse. It's galloping very quickly, and then it gets to a crossroads, and a friend of his shouts, "Where are you going?" The man says, "I don't know. Ask the horse." And Han says, "This is our situation. The horse is the technology. It carries us, and we cannot control it. So we have to begin with intention, asking ourselves, what do we want? So, what do we want to design in terms of our collective future?"
Fantastic. So Elizabeth, I guess this is we're kind of getting on to like the last of my questions, but what strategies would you say that employees and employers can use to improve the quality of their digitized lives?
I have seen in working with organisations some quite thoughtful approaches to the digital workplace, in terms of a range of, for example, training and interventions that are designed to help people and recognise that there are stages that we need to go through in getting to know how to use technology, and that we kind of gradually mature through that. And I think that's really important. And I mean, there's an example that's very much in the public domain, which is what Barclays have done with their digital eagles. And I know now this is largely seen as a sort of marketing campaign, and they have digital eagles and branches who help people, customers get up to speed with technology. But originally it started as an initiative inside the organization, I think with a very small number of digital eagles recruited, who then in a sort of ripple effect started helping colleagues to get up to speed with new tools they were introducing at the time, and recruited new kind of champions. And this way of kind of working inside the organization, almost quite grassroots, champions, reverse mentoring. So some really creative programs that are recognizing and the sort of the human quality and the things that we're trying to grapple with in working with technology, and going beyond, we need to train you on this tool so that you'll use it and you'll be more productive. So, that kind of basic sort of reductive approach. I think another one I've come across is what Ford have done with, community managers inside the organization. And I think they have a kind of yellow, green, black belt type setup where you can, but again, it's very thoughtful in helping people to move through at kind of levels of proficiency and kind of gain digital skills for life as well as work.
Would you say then, Elizabeth, that actually what we do need then are kind of industry guidelines or kind of national guidelines in terms of the ways that companies and digital and their employees interact with this digital ecosystem? Or would you say that it's actually much more of an individual case-by-case strategy that companies need to understand tech and work-life balance?
I think there are going to be elements that you'll see, characteristics and types of, if we need to learn, for example, qualities of communicating, being creative, sort of managing technology and the sort of work-life blend or balance. I think there are going to be elements that are similar, but it very much needs to be sensitive to, the particular environment and kind of practices inside that organization. So what's the culture? What kind of roles do we have? Where are people working? What's their prior experience with technology? So, sometimes, I see things I mentioned earlier around generations and you see things about, the millennials are coming into the workplace, so it's fine. They'll just adopt the technology and, but it's actually much more nuanced. And, I've talked to people who've really gone out and done the research in the organization. And one person I was talking to in a government organization, they were saying, actually we found sort of millennials were tending to say to us, we feel a bit embarrassed about using this workplace social network. What's that? And so there are different challenges in different parts of the organization and different demographics, roles. So we need to really understand, just as we do to design the technology, what are the real needs there. And the other aspect of that is, you mentioned earlier about, different models of business, different approaches to business and kind of different measures of success. If we think about that, those levels of digital literacy, if the leaders in our organizations don't have this really expansive and kind of broad understanding of digital for themselves, how are they going to create those things? So I think that's a really, really important area.
So Elizabeth, we've come to the end of the talk, but where can people contact you and find out more about your work?
So I'm on LinkedIn. If people go to digitalworkresearch.com, that'll link you through to my LinkedIn page, and that's where I sort of blog and write.
That's great stuff. Well, Elizabeth Marsh, thanks so much for spending time with us today and sharing your insight. I'm very, very grateful that you did so.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, Lawrence. Thank you.